it takes a lot of courage when you are outside of a community, or when you're outside, like, when you don't have that validation of your skills that credentials provide, to actually step up and apply for a job. And so giving those people a chance is generally a good policy to find misfits, and that's been very successful for me.
I love that. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Educative Sessions, a podcast series with people in the developer world about their coding experiences. This is brought to you by Educative, which makes it easy for authors to provide interactive and adaptive courses for software developers. Today, my guest is Neeraj Kashyap, who is the CEO of Moonstream.io. And today,
sorry.
I'm sorry?
Moonstream.to.
Oh, Moonstream.to, excuse
Yeah.
me. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
And we're going to be, this is what I decided to title our talk, which is Focusing on the Misfits and How to Properly Hire in Tech. Neeraj, thank you so much for being part of this talk.
Thanks, Lee. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So let's begin with, you've had a very storied career in Silicon Valley, and yet your entrance into this community is a little unorthodox. So I'd love to, let's, as quickly as we can, talk about all of your impressive work over the years, and the companies you've been a part of, and how you were able to navigate your way into these great companies.
Sure. I started my life as a mathematician. And when I say mathematician, I mean the type of mathematician that only works on pen and paper all day, every day. And I entered technology because I became very interested in healthcare, and I became very interested in diseases like Parkinson's disease, and other diseases that degenerate the brain, like the palsies and stuff like that. And yeah, basically after I got my PhD, I said, I just want to spend my life studying these diseases. So I moved to Japan, and I was doing research about these diseases for basically 2 years. I lived in Japan for 2 years doing that research. And you can't really do research on diseases like on pen and paper. You have to work with people, you have to work with devices. We were coming up with diagnostic systems for those diseases that could outperform a doctor. And that's how I got into technology. So we were using accelerometers and gyroscopes to basically analyze people's movements to try and understand if they have dementias or Parkinson's disease or any other disease that affects the brain, because these diseases that affect the brain, they generally manifest themselves in terms of a person's gait going off, or like, people falling down and things like that. So we were analyzing their gaits in order to understand whether they had these diseases. And that's what got me into technology. The mathematical background certainly helped. But that's what made me fall in love with programming and with building software and with building things that, like, other people use and that improve other people's lives. Because when you're doing mathematics, when you're doing mathematical research, if you're lucky, there's like 5 people in the world that care about what you're doing. And when you're writing software, like, you really know every line of code that you write has like the potential to actually improve the lives of like a lot of people out in the world, which is just a different sort of pleasure that you get, from your work. So that's what got me into technology. It was pretty hard to make a living as an academic in Japan, and I didn't really want to do that, for an extended period of time. So at some point, once my postdoc in Japan ended, I decided, hey, like, the place where I hear they're doing this stuff all the time is Silicon Valley. So let's move there and see what happens. So I moved to Silicon Valley. And initially, the technology that I developed in Japan, I sort of made a business, tried to make a business in Silicon Valley where, we built that technology and brought it to retailers in the US. And that didn't work out, but that's how I ended up in Silicon Valley. And then from there, I mostly work in startups. I enjoy working with startups and in startups. I've run the AI teams for companies like Doc AI and Human API, companies in healthcare. But I've also worked at Google. I've worked on the Tensorflow team at Google, and now I'm like extremely involved in the blockchain, and I'm running my own company, Moonstream. Yeah.
Wow. Well, that's incredible, and I'm largely amazed by how like you've transitioned to so many different things, and yet you started out as a mathematician, right? It gives, I think, a lot of people potentially hope that you don't have to feel so fixed on just because you studied a thing, therefore that's the thing you do, especially if it's something that has a lot of potential applications. And what it sounds like it's you've been largely motivated by your own preferences and your own passions, especially for things like healthcare and AI. So, and I want to transition a little bit to what we're talking about today. So you've worked in all these different companies and you've built all these teams. And when we were preparing for this talk, it sounded like you had a radically different philosophy when it comes to hiring than what most people do. So, some people look for certain degrees, institutions they come from, backgrounds, etc., etc. But you follow a different algorithm. Let's put it that way. Let's go more into that. So, what are you exactly looking for in a candidate?
A lot. It's informed by my own experiences. Coming into tech, not having been trained in technology beforehand. The important thing to realize, so what most people are looking for, at least what I see on the market, is people are looking for credentials, right? So if you're trying to build a team and you're sort of operating at a certain scale or beyond a certain scale, maybe you're not doing your own hiring, maybe you have like recruiters who are in charge of hiring or that kind of thing. And generally what works well for candidates is that they have credentials like, oh, do you have a computer science degree from Stanford or from MIT or from Berkeley, or any or some big school like in your country if you're hiring in a different country than the US. Or have you won some competitions like programming competitions? Do you have like a really good score on lead code? Or these are the kinds of things that people look for. They look for credentials. But ultimately, I think looking for credentials misses the point of what someone who builds software actually does. It is a skill, but it's also sort of it's also a craft, and people with different backgrounds sort of bring different things into this craft. So just to give you an example, I think like some of the best programmers I know were not educated in computer science. They used to be philosophers, or they used to be historians, and then they came in. They came into tech because, well, it makes sense to come into tech these days, and it's made sense to come into tech
Right.
since the 90s.
Right.
But they brought an analytical ability that isn't trained just by learning how to interact with a program. It's trained by doing deep analysis on any topic. I mean, the philosopher does deep analysis on philosophy. Historians actually do deep analysis on historical events, right?
Right.
In interpretation and things like that. The fact that they have that analytical ability and they can use that ability to solve problems is really what matters. It doesn't matter whether they know like programming language X or container technology Y. It really doesn't matter. What really matters is that they can they understand how to solve problems fundamentally well, and then they can learn the skills that they need. Like they can learn the programming languages and the other technologies that they need in order to actually like bring that problem solving ability to bear
Mm-hmm.
on whatever they need to do as part of your team. And that's the important thing to understand, and that's what informs sort of like this different way of looking at how you bring people into a team.
Got it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, personally, I appreciate that greatly. I, as like you, have not had a formal technical training in most things. And I find that most people haven't actually when you work in tech. And I think what you've done is, I think appropriately demystified a lot of technology as requiring like a specific skill set in order for you to thrive. Sure, that's absolutely the case when you want to become, say, an engineer, or if you want to do a certain thing,
Yeah.
you need to know this. But as you, I assume, know, and I've learned from my own experiences, technology it requires all the skill sets. It's you're building companies, you're building communities, you're building ecosystems and environments, and you can't just do that strictly with engineers, right? You need to do
Yeah.
it with a lot more. Um, so, let's say like you've got people with certain interesting backgrounds. Are there other things like beyond, say, fields of study or different styles of analysis that you try to look for when it comes to a candidate? If a candidate doesn't have a lot of experience specifically in tech, is that necessarily a deal breaker for you? I'd love to go a little bit more about the misfits and how we joke that you have a bit of a Moneyball-esque approach. I'd love to know a little bit more about what that means for you.
Definitely. So for the most part, what you need to look for, definitely what I look for when I bring someone onto one of my teams, is more sort of personality and culture. I don't, I'm not running like 100 people teams or something like that. In general, no single person I think should be running, you know, involved in the day-to-day activities of like, more than maybe 10 people. So the important thing is like, what kind of a culture does your team have? That's something that you as someone who's building a team need to have a very clear idea about. For me, I'm looking for people who generally um, don't have an ego. Like you don't want to have like ego problems on a team. You want to have like a sort of I want to have a culture of modesty, people who are like willing to learn from each other, people who don't like whose self-esteem isn't based on like how they're perceived by their direct peers, but like on their output into the world. I think that's like much more important. And who are willing to learn and who are hungry to learn. Those are sort of the characteristics that I look for. And it's an interesting thing, candidates who are more credentialed, just on average, like let's say that someone who doesn't have credentials, someone who doesn't have a computer science degree from a top university puts themselves into the candidate pool, then they generally have more of a growth mentality because they were willing to take that first risk to even enter the pool of candidates. So they probably have like more of on average mentality to like grow and to work hard and to like really hustle than somebody who's like who looks good on paper, because the people who look good on paper just have to work less hard to even sort of enter that pool in the first place. So just right. As a numbers game, if you really want to play Moneyball, if you want to identify people who might be more of a cultural fit, look for those outliers that where like you think at first like, it's strange that this person applied for this job. Actually, that's where usually the value lies, because those are the people that are being skipped over for jobs by everyone else. And but there's a reason that they're applying generally. It takes a lot of courage when you are outside of a community, or when you're outside, like, when you don't have that validation of your skills that credentials provide, to actually step up and apply for a job. And so giving those people a chance is generally a good policy to find misfits, and that's been very successful for me.
I love that because I feel like many people who are looking to get in or looking for that opportunity of inclusion know that experience of just not being right because they just didn't decide that one thing. But I like that you're acknowledging that, and I hope, well, not too much, because then it messes with your algorithm. That's the thing, is like if everybody catches on to this mentality, then it's just like what happened with like sabermetrics. Like everybody started to do it, and then it started to become less and less effective. But I think this is at least a good thing for a lot of people who are interested or inspired into technology, that it's not too late, and that there are absolutely at the top echelons places that are not going to penalize you for having a different background. In fact, if anything, they're encouraged to look at it. So that's great to hear. So we've come to the end of our questions, Neeraj. I know this goes by really fast, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about Moonstream, and or you can talk about whatever you like. Really, the floor is yours. Go for it.
I'd love to talk about Moonstream. So what we're building at Moonstream is an open source platform for blockchain analytics. So if you own crypto, or if you develop for blockchains like the Ethereum blockchain or something like that, it's generally pretty difficult to understand what people are doing on the blockchain. It used to be easier, the community used to be smaller. There used to be fewer people that were actually doing stuff on blockchains. And at that time, like, these communities functioned as villages where, like, you could like just sort of follow along with the local gossip to know like what was going on. But now there's like, 10 million people participating in blockchains, more than tens of millions of people participating in the various blockchains, and it's no longer a village, right? It's a big city. So how do you know like what's the important stuff going on these different blockchains that's pertinent to you, that could be of value to you? And you can't do that just by like, listening to the local gossip, because like the Discord server that you're on probably doesn't know about like this huge activity that's going to happen over here in the next couple of days. And there's no real way to find out about it before it happens, unless you have, you have machine learning algorithms that are processing the data, the public data that's available on all of these blockchains, and surfacing to you the stuff that that could be relevant to you and could be important to you. And that's what we're building with Moonstream. Is we analyze all of the data that people produce on blockchains. We understand like using static analysis, like even like what's going on with the programs, what are the semantics of those programs, And then from that, we understand like, okay, this is relevant for this type of activity. And so if you if you sign up for an account on Moonstream, you can say, I want to know, like, whenever there's a new NFT that has been minted but hasn't been like released yet, because then I want to sort of get in on that action. You can sort of set up a trigger at that level of abstraction and get alerted when we find activities like that on the blockchain. So that's Moonstream. We have a community on GitHub. So if you just search for Moonstream on GitHub, you'll be able to find us. We also have a community on Discord. You're welcome to join us. That's us.
Wow, fantastic. And it sounds like a lot of what you're doing now is starting at the community level. But I think I'm a community guy, so like that's the way to go about things. Neeraj Kashyap, thank you so much for being on our show, and thank you for contributing your fantastic wisdom and your knowledge on such a vital subject for a lot of people. And I want to thank everyone else for either listening or watching this podcast as well. You can look at more episodes on our YouTube channel, or you can look us up on pretty much any podcasting channel at Educative Sessions. And lastly, if you want to learn a little bit more about Educative, check us out at Educative.io. So for all of us here at Educative, thank you so much and happy learning. Bye-bye now. Hope you enjoyed that session. This episode is available on YouTube and also on many podcast platforms. If you'd like to be part of Educative Sessions, the form is open now to apply via the link below. You can also email me at lee@educative.io. Lastly, don't forget to like and comment on our content. Be sure to subscribe for us as well. And of course, you can learn more about us at educative.io. Happy learning.